Good morning. I am Dr. Christine Bacon, and welcome to Breakfast with Bacon. Have I got a show for you today? I am, as you see, on the air with my friend Walt Heyer. He is the author of this book here called Trans Life Survivors. It is a powerful and moving story, and it is absolutely perfect for such a time as this, as would be said in the Bible, because we have so much misunderstanding about people who are struggling with gender dysphoria, who society is pushing them into sex change surgeries and saying that will make life happy, and really without even listening to the persons, or in some cases I'll call them the victims of such ideology. So my guest today, Walt Heyer, is, as you can see, very much a man who was born biologically a man and who for 7 years lived as a woman, had gender reassignment surgery, and at one point decided this is not who he is, and he reclaimed his biological gender as a man. And he's here today to tell us his story. So Walt, God bless you, first of all, for sharing this story. I am so honored that you decided to be my guest today.
Well, Doctor, thank you for having me on. It's really a pleasure to be on and share this really important, extremely important story with the audience. And that's why I wrote that book, Trans Life Survivors. It really came out of my own testimony to start with. I thought when I first started having doubts many years ago, now over 30 years ago, that maybe I was just the only one in the world that was having difficulty after going through this supposed treatment program that they prescribe for people who are struggling with identity disorders. And what I came to realize was when I started the website sexchangeregret.com, I had people start to write me. And it's funny, Christine, because the first year I had 700 people, this about 10 years ago, maybe 11 years ago, come to the website. So some time back. But by 2015, I had over 350,000 people come to visit the website.
Wow. Now,
so you realize the scale of what had happened over the first 5 to 6 years was dramatic, for going from 700 people visiting the site to over 350,000. So you can see there was a tremendous impact, and people were beginning to realize that not everybody is happy after they undergo these surgeries, and realize many of them become what we call detransitioners. They have regret for whatever reason. So that's the book actually was written because I had either sat down with or had phone calls with or exchanged emails with thousands of people who had regret, not one or two, but thousands. And I knew that I could easily put 200 or 300 of them in a book, but I thought I needed to scale that book back so that people could read it, be impacted by the truth from it. And so I just put 30 of them in the book, but that 30 really represents thousands. It's just that I selected 30 so that the book was fairly palatable at just under 300 pages.
Wow. And I've already read some of the stories, and my heart aches like the people who transitioned and supposedly had all life together. The young man, woman who became the first transgender homecoming king. And so on the outside, everything was, as the trans movement people try to say, good. He had a loving family, accepting friends, everything was good, and yet he still killed himself.
Yeah.
So yeah. The surgery, the living, the acceptance isn't what's killing people. It's not what's necessary. What's necessary is an acceptance of oneself. Is that correct?
Well, what's necessary is what I always dig into, and is when people write me or I talk to them on the phone, I always ask, what happened that caused you to not like who you are?
Because in every case,
kind of
right?
There's the real key. every case, 100% of the people that I have talked to about this issue, they can all identify what happened, what was the issue, what caused this, whether it was an emotional situation, whether it was a traumatic loss, a suicide by the father or the mother, or whether it was alcoholism or mental illness in the home, or abandonment or sexual abuse, physical abuse. I mean, one was upset with being who he was because he had been passed to 7 foster homes. And he thought, you know, I'm just a worthless human being. I may as well, transition to a female. So I think there was another story, there is, in fact, another story in there about a Canadian girl who became a boy and was accepted into the trans community, even given the whole trans community, president of the group in the trans community had the Center for Transgenders that she was responsible for. And she ended up committing suicide. And a friend was interviewed and said, well, what do you think happened? And they said, well, they never really dealt with the depression that she'd had all her life. And so this is, we call these things comorbidities. The thing that really drives these people who struggle with their identity are comorbid disorders, whether it's bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, body dysmorphia. You can go down the list, dissociative disorders, and there's just so many of them. Some of them are sexual disorders. Some are social adjustment disorders. There are just so many of them that it becomes very complex in trying to, everybody wants to go up to the drive-up window and order their perfect meal and get it in a second. But this is very complicated, and it takes a long time to work with people so that we can flesh out what that really was. And the truth is, not one person needs hormones or surgery.
I agree. What they need to learn is to accept themselves and love themselves who they are. What gets me too, Walt, is, speaking to you, right? You're a man, you're like, I want to be a woman. I want to feel like a woman. I feel like a woman. And I always say, well, what's it feel like to be a woman?
Yeah.
I can tell you what it feels like to be Christine Bacon, but my sister in New Hampshire, Marie Danielson, might feel different as a woman, and my sister Kathy in Montana might feel different. So what does it mean to feel like a woman? We all feel differently. There's no definition of the experience of womanness and vice versa, right? So it's like, well, what are you really searching for? Would that be a fair question to ask someone who's looking to transition?
Yeah, so, what they want to do when you're faced with somebody who's struggling with this idea about changing genders is that they're going to put things ahead of their conversation to try to get you to stop asking questions. And so one of them is, I feel like a woman. Well, that argument can't go anywhere because they don't know what a woman feels like. All they can do is express that they feel like they're a woman. And so I think you made a great point, is that no two women actually know. We're going to have two different ideas of what a woman feels like.
Right.
Two men are going to have a different idea what a man feels like. So, and there's a truth here. There are feminine men and there are masculine women and everything in between. But feminine men are not females, and masculine women are not men. So, this is another thing where society needs to understand that all of us who fall into these different categories are still created by the Lord Jesus Christ. And he made them in their great uniqueness, and we need to accept and embrace and understand that uniqueness. I mean, I've watched these shows where, there's one lady that lives in the wilderness at the top of the North Pole all by herself, and she can shoot animals, she can, field dress animals. I mean, I couldn't do that.
Neither could I.
Does that make her?
Right. Does that make her a man?
Yeah, it doesn't make her a man. And so we need to understand that we all have different gifts, different talents, and we've really been sold a huge bill of goods. And one of the things that really people are always asking me, why did you detransition back? Weren't you happy? What happened? Were you just not a transgender? And so I remember, you know, struggling with what was I going to do. I'd already changed my birth certificate, my social security, my driver's license. I was working as a female named Laura Jensen for the federal government. How was I going to get all this back? And was I really a woman? I mean, that was the question I'd ask. I just spent several $1,000s because they said they can transition. They use that word transition and make you a transgender female. So I contacted, when I began having the regrets, I contacted the therapist who approved me for surgery and the surgeon, Dr. Biber, who performed the surgery. And I said, I would like to go to court in California, in San Mateo, California, and flush this whole idea about surgical genders, using hormones, and so forth. Would you be willing to do that for me so that I can restore my birth record, restore my social security card, and restore myself back to being Walt? Well, this was, you know, many years ago, 1990.
In the 80s? 90s, wow.
This was 1990. And so when I feel like in some ways I was challenging them to prove that they could do this. They didn't see it that way, but in my mind, I thought that's what I was doing. So they wrote a letter that was presented to court that they admitted, the doctor and the psychologist admitted that hormones and surgery has never, ever changed a man into a woman. It doesn't happen. The most that you can achieve by giving someone, I was on hormones for 10 years, and the most that you can ever expect to achieve is what they referred to as neuter. You're not female or male at some point during this process.
You're
so
like a eunuch.
Yes, and so I know in one article that they did in Australia about, they called 3 of us who they wrote about the in-betweeners. And I think, you know, the idea that we change from one gender to the other, or transition, the word transition is actually a false narrative. Nobody transitions. You remain a man. You're going to always be a man. And the surgeon and the psychologist both wrote to the court and said that's true, that it is impossible for hormones and surgery, even if the person feels like or thinks they know what a woman feels like, can a man become a woman. So that was, to me, sort of this huge awakening in terms of why are they using these terms like transgender? And so I started digging into it. And so, you know, I've written 7 books, and this Trans Life Survivors, one psychiatric doctor in Arizona who's a forensic psychiatric doctor. I didn't even know forensic psychiatric doctors existed, but I sent him a copy of it and said, just tell me what you think. He has purchased 700 of those books.
This one here, Trans Life Survivors?
To hand out to other psychiatric doctors and tell them, you need to read this. This is an important read for you to understand the consequences of what happens when you falsely tell somebody that you can change them into a woman and then cut off body parts that don't need to be cut off, and to give them hormones that they don't need that sometimes cause irreversible damage and blood clots and brain tumors. I've worked with people who've had brain tumors and literally die because what happens is they want to speed the process up. Once they start the hormones, is they'll get a regular regimen of hormones, but then they contact a pharmacy in Canada, or they contact another one in Mexico, and now they're taking 3 times what they should be taking, and it causes blood clots.
Wow.
So they become their own doctors, and people think that it's safe. It's not. And once they have the opportunity to sort of latch on to these hormones, they become like a drug addict. They want this change to occur so quickly that you realize they're dealing with an obsessive compulsive disorder that was probably part of a dissociative disorder or some unresolved pain that they had in their life. And I can share with you and the people listening that nearly 50% of the people that I've worked with over the last 10 years were sexually abused. And this includes me, who was sexually abused. But when people began to say, Walt, you were never a transgender, you're a fake, you're a fraud. And I had somebody write me for nearly 3 years, Christine, that kept saying, take down your website. You know, you're a nut job. You don't know what you're talking about. And I kept writing them back. And I said, you know, I appreciate that you have this differing point of view.
Yeah.
But there's two sides to this. And everyone needs to have both sides to make a good evaluation. And he went through this with me for years. And then finally he wrote me almost 2 years ago now. He says, I'm the guy who's been writing you about taking your website down. Can you help me detransition? Because I now have regret. So, you know,
he was fighting it, and he didn't want you there because you were a sign of everything he was trying to fight. And
exactly.
yeah.
And what I found out that's so instructive for this conversation is that I've had regret occur as little as 6 days after surgery,
Ooh.
which is the shortest term, to 3 weeks, to 3 months, all the way up to 30 years. I've had 3 cases 30 years after surgery that they regretted it and wanted to detransition. And here's probably the most shocking or interesting or unspoken truth that people don't realize. 90% plus of the people I work with are not homosexual. It's not about sex. It's about a struggle they had with who they are. And the only individuals that cross-dress and identify as transgender are what everyone knows about it, called drag queens. That all of the drag queens are the homosexual group. They identify as homosexual, they identify as transgender, but what's most interesting about that group is that they don't have what we call bottom surgery. They are still men biologically, and they will have breast implants. They will look very flamboyant. You know, they're the ones that are leading the gay pride parades with their eyelashes this far out. But they are not the ones that you referred to in opening about people struggling with gender dysphoria or their identity. These are people who are homosexual, that are very flamboyant, very out front. They're the ones that have been doing the public library thing, trying to convince kids that this was normal behavior, thinking that all men who dress are homosexual. But there's a truth here. There's a term called autogynephilia and transvestic fetishes that make up the largest portion of the people who identify as female men and a few women. And what autogynephilia is so interesting is that 100% of the men that I've worked with who had a mental disorder of some kind, or they had autogynephilia. Autogynephilia is when they put on women's clothing, makeup, hair, wig, whatever, and look in the mirror. Get this, this is really powerful. What they see in the mirror is the object of their sexual affection. It is themselves. So they literally fall in love with the image they see in the mirror of who they are. And so that is their sexual gratification. They're not homosexual. They don't engage in sexual behavior with other people. They don't need other people. And then the other subgroup,
is that like a 90%, 100%? So I'm a man and I'm dressing up as a woman and I'll call myself a drag queen. I'm attracted to my own image of me as a female. So am I not pursuing?
Let's separate this, because that's a great question.
Okay.
Drag queens do not have autogynephilia.
Okay.
They are the homosexual group. Autogynephilia is a heterosexual issue, only heterosexual.
Okay.
Heterosexual men who do not have any desire for same-sex attraction or to have sex with a man only want to have sex they become sexually gratified
by the woman they see in the mirror.
By
so
what
when
they
they're
see
dressed up.
That's their sexual gratification. They don't engage in sex with men. The homosexual group is strictly the drag queens. But 90% of the men that I work with or more are heterosexual men who are married, have children, grow up, maybe they've been married for 20 years, 18, 25 years, they have 4 children, and they're running off to someplace outside of town and dressing up as females and leaving their wife behind. And that's where their sexual gratification comes from. And the wives contact me and say, my husband is just not into me anymore. And he's leaving town, says he's a transgender. And I always ask, is he sexually aroused when he gets dressed as a female? And when they reply, they say, yes. I said, well, most likely he's either has a transvestic fetish, which is different than autogynephilia. A transvestic fetish is when he becomes sexually aroused by a particular piece of clothing, maybe shoes or some lingerie or something of that nature. That's a sexual fetish disorder. Autogynephilia is another kind of sexual fetish. These individuals who are heterosexual men really aren't transgender at all. They're suffering from sexual disorders. And they're people who are just simple men, many of them married, who are simple transgenders. And they somehow get some emotional release from dressing as females. And they like to go sit in lobbies of hotels or go out to dinner by themselves and sort of trick people into thinking that they're female. But they will go home and have heterosexual sex with their wife. They don't necessarily get aroused by going out. They just like the idea of pretending they're women and going out in public and passing. So one of the struggles I've had for many years is people writing saying, well, how did you get over homosexuality? I said, well, I was never homosexual. In my case, had a dissociative disorder because I was sexually abused for a period of time that caused me to not want to be who I was. And so, sexual abuse is a crime, and it destroys the image we have of sexuality. It destroys the image we have of ourselves. And unfortunately, the people who are giving struggling with their identity and ignoring the fact that they were sexually abused, maybe they were physically abused or emotionally abused. These are all people who should never, ever be given hormones and never should fall into the line of undergoing surgery. They need good psychotherapy.
It just makes me so angry that people are willing to take advantage of them for the sake of an ideology.
It should.
We can look at California, Walt, and where they've recently dropped the age of a man can have sex with a child as young as 14 with a 10-year age gap. If the child consents, that's not pedophilia. There's no longer any punishment for that. It's like, are you kidding me?
Yeah, and you know what? You're so right. And in my other book, Paper Genders, one of the second book that I wrote, Paper Genders, in there I talk about the origin of transgender identity was started by 3 men, Alfred Kinsey, Harry Benjamin, and John Money. Now, what do the 3 men have in common? They were all pedophile activists. They all 3 believed that it was healthy and important for adult men to have sex with young boys. And in the case of Kinsey, he believed that it was okay for adult men to have sex with infants.
Oh my gosh.
So you're looking at a group of people who started this ideology that are really psychologically
sick and twisted.
Oh yeah. And yet we have this whole thing that just keeps going. And most interesting is that when Harry Benjamin opened his gender clinic in the early 70s and started performing hormone therapy, and they didn't actually do surgery at his clinic. The clinic took in people and they did cross-gender hormone therapy. And then the guy who was administering hormone therapy, his name was Dr. Charles L. Illenfeld. Interesting enough, he himself was out in public homosexual doctor who administered these hormones. He worked at that Benjamin Clinic in New York for 6 years, and he administered cross-gender hormone therapy to 500 men who had undergone the surgery. And at the end of 6 years, he was speaking in Tappan, New York, to a group of therapists who were beginning to learn how to
deal with this,
counsel people who are struggling with identity disorders. And he told this group, he says, I'm leaving the practice of administering hormone therapy because what I have seen over the last 6 years with the 500 people that I've worked with is that there is too much unhappiness after surgery, and too many of them end in suicides. He said, I'm going to become a psychiatric doctor.
Wow.
So that I can actually help the people deal
with
the much deeper issues. Now, what should make us all angry, I've written about this so many times, and it's in my books, Paper Gender, and we had the information. This was 1979 that this came out. And as a result of Dr. Paul McHugh making the same statement, similar statement in 1979, and Illenfeld's statement about dangers of hormones, the gender clinics across the country closed. It was done. By 1980, they had closed all the clinics because they said it was ineffective, it was causing too much harm, and we don't have a good track on the long-term outcomes. So they had it right back in 79. But then there was my doctor, my surgeon, Dr. Biber, who I met with a psychologist, Dr. Paul Walker, who wrote the Harry Benjamin International Standards of Care that is now morphed into the standards of care that they use today. I mean, he wrote this standards of care in 1979, 1980, and 1981. They kept revising it and working it. He became my doctor, my therapist in 1981. He never said anything about the reports of regret that Illenfeld had reported. They ignored all. See, they don't.
That's what makes me angry too.
Yes.
They validate themselves by hiding other information. That's what the mainstream media is doing today and other issues. Well, if we squelch the opposing opinions, then people will see only what we say. And it's like, are you? Anyway,
I know, and that's why I keep speaking out. And
and I'm so glad you do. You must take a lot of persecution for it.
I recently have gotten some really ugly mail that is just I don't respond to it, but it shows the depth of depravity of the things that they say. But what's interesting is the Lord just keeps holding me up, because in less than a month I'll be 80 years old, and I know I don't look over 20.
No, I would have put you around 26.
20, maybe 27. So, to me, it's so important that all of my books are, and the real key books, the one that you have, Paper Genders, those, if you only read 2 books on the subject, those 2 books are life-changing books for people to understand what's going on.
We need to get this into the hands of all the young men and women who are considering having sex change surgery, sex reassignment.
And
surgery.
Most importantly, the parents who support it, because there are many parents who support these things, and they think, oh, it's fine, because they have no.
I just want my child to be happy. I love my child.
Goodness. Yeah. And so Paper Genders, Trans Life Survivors, and there's another book that has, I put it into a book, about 60 of the published articles I have, because they start taking them down because, they want to cancel me. So I figured I better put them in a book that I can retain and get it out there. And that's called Articles of Impeachment Against Sex Change Surgery. So all those are on my website, sexchangeregret.com. But we're battling a huge, massive amount of money that George Soros is involved in, and many other people who are putting hundreds of millions of dollars in. And like many people like myself, I've been helping people for 10 years, answering emails and sort of mentoring them for 10 years without ever taking one dime, requiring any dime. I've had some people make donations to keep us going, which I appreciate. But we don't ever charge anybody. We don't turn anybody down or say, I'm not going to talk to you if you don't buy a book, or, you know,
Right.
We're here to help and encourage people toward a good outcome. And I know the work that we're doing
it's making a difference.
It's making a difference, has long-term positive effects, even if they've gone through it and they find themselves having some doubts. Reading the book, like Trans Life Survivors, has encouraged people. In fact, I've had one particular guy called and he said, you know, I read my story in that book and I realized I need to detransition. So those stories oftentimes mirror the stories of people who are out there. And so it's daunting. It's 7 days a week, 365 days a year to do what we do, but it's just so important because
one day you'll get to die and get to go to heaven and whew, put this behind you and, you know that you did everything you could to get as many people to come to heaven with you. I mean, that's really what it is. You work your butt off while you're here, you know? So, well, let me go back to the beginning then. So can you share with our viewers your story? Take us to your childhood. You're born obviously in 1940 then, if you're about to turn 80.
That's right.
And so, yeah, you weren't talking a lot of transgender back then. All you really, that must have been really, so take us back there. What was your childhood like?
Well, this is probably the most interesting part, is that I went over to my grandmother's house when my parents would go fishing in California. They loved to go up in middle California and go fishing on the lakes up there. And they would drop me off at my mother's house. And she was a seamstress. That's the way she made her money. She came from a very poor background and she made women's dresses. And I remember leaning on her sewing machine and watching her, you know, make dresses. And I just hung out with her there over a weekend from Friday night to Sunday evening. And I became curious about the dresses she was making. And she said something, I don't remember the conversation exactly, but somehow she was encouraged to make me a purple chiffon evening dress. I don't know if she said, would you like me to make you one? Or I have no idea how that conversation came about, but she made me. Because
you were about how old at this point?
4 years old.
4.
So what we know today, what I know today, after looking back over 75 years, is that when Grandma made me that dress and slipped me into that perfectly fitting chiffon dress, what she was saying to me without using the words is, there's something wrong with you as a boy. And people miss this. So when we're dressing boys up as girls, it's not benign. You know, we're actually, especially if we continue this repetition, I'm not going to tell you that dressing a boy up as a girl one time is going to harm them. But I can tell you, if you repeat that behavior and then
or affirm it,
reinforce it by affirming how cute they are, how wonderful they are, how excited Grandma became because she was so, you know, just loved me as a girl. I could see that coming through, but she didn't like me as the little boy with the little Acme cowboy boots and the tore up blue jeans and the beat up shirt. And I was a dirty little kid, but that's who I was. But she was transforming that little boy, telling him there's something wrong with you as a boy. Because at 4 years old, you have no idea about consequences. That word consequences is not a word that ever enters into this. We just change kids' genders and send them off to school and tell them they can be anybody they want. But nobody stops and says, what are the consequences of doing that? I can tell you, they're devastating. I'm still dealing with them. That's why I'm talking about it today. And so the key point too was she said, this is our little secret. Now, if there's a secret, you know there's something wrong. If you're
what do you think do you think Grandma had an issue at all? Do you think, I mean, the fact that she called it a secret,
you know,
think maybe she struggled with this area, or?
You know, Grandma was a very rotund, unattractive, heavy smoking, heavy drinking, crippled lady.
So she had to have some acceptance issues herself.
Yes. So, you know, and so I don't know if she was trying to live vicariously through me, the way she wanted people to see her, I don't know. I mean, that's certainly something that the psychologist would be good to explore. But there was something about her addressing me as a little girl, affirming me as a girl, and being overjoyed with how cute I looked. But that went on for about 2.5 years until I became, frankly, I became addicted to the affirmation about how cute I was. I mean, it's addicting. I mean, I don't know anybody who doesn't want to be affirmed.
Sure. Now, were you getting affirmation at home with mom or dad? Was there struggles? Because you mentioned earlier that there was sexual abuse. Where was that coming from?
Yeah, Carrie, I'll get through that.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So that's all right. So what happened was, after 2.5 years, I snuck the dress home because I could never go home because it was a secret. And I put it in my bottom dresser drawer, and my mother found the dress and said, "Where did you get this?" And I said, "Well, Grandma made it." And of course, the house exploded. Dad was like so angry that Grandma would dress his manly boy up in a dress. I was never allowed to go back to Grandma's. The purple dress disappeared, but I was left with the scars, the emotional and psychological scars that was imprinted on me for 2.5 years by Grandma. And so their affirmation of me as a little boy paled in comparison to the constant direct affirmation Grandma was giving me as a little girl. So you can see that deliberate affirmation as a little girl was much more influential than the normal. They didn't see any need to affirm me as a boy. I was a boy, you know, so it's sort of a different deal. So, but the abuse came in when it was twofold. My dad then decided that I was almost like he wanted to be the blacksmith and I was the iron. So he was going to shape me into being a man by physically abusing me and spanking me. And he wanted to toughen me up. That was his fear. But keep in mind, you were only in the middle 1940s, 1946, 47, somewhere in there. There was no internet. There was no, people had no idea what to do with this. I'm sure he was devastated and shocked and had no tools. So his method was just to shape me into a man as best he knew how. Well, when his brother, who was a teenager at the time, adopted brother, found out I'd been wearing a dress, that became kind of the family thing. And so he decided that I was fair game to be sexually abused. And so my uncle began to sexually abuse me, teach, touch, do all the things that are inappropriate. So you can see, before I was 10 years old, I was dealing with being cross-dressed and affirmed as a girl, not as a boy that I was. I was being physically abused because somebody's trying to, shape and mold me like a horseshoe and a blacksmith over the iron, and sexually abused by an uncle who thought I was fair game because he thought who knows what he thought. So I had no tools as a young person to deal with this. So I began to internalize everything. And when I told my parents about what Fred had done to me, they said, "Well, Fred would never do that. You must be lying." And of course, Fred denied that he ever did it. So I then realized I couldn't trust anybody. I couldn't trust my family with the truth. People would just call me a liar. So I became silent and just withdrew within myself. But after I got in my early teens, I created this name, Crystal West, because that was sort of the purple dress that was still living in me. Even though the dress was gone, it was living in my head. And so I really began to think that I should have been born a girl. I'd have been better off. I wouldn't have been sexually abused. I wouldn't have been physically abused. I would have been fine. And, all would have been well. And that's what you think when you're a young child and dealing with these things without proper psychotherapy or proper understanding of what's occurring. So I brought all that along. Now, I started dating girls in high school. I was in a car club. I had a 1934 Ford with a Corvette engine in it. I was working 3 jobs, to make money to sort of look like a man. I was really trying to be a man and try to show myself off. I was in sports. I was the kicker on the football team. I ran track. I had all of the outward
manifestations,
of a very healthy young boy. But inside, I was being eaten alive by that purple dress, by the physical abuse and being sexually abused. I had no place to deal with it. I was trying to deal with, a crime of sexual abuse and no place to take it. So,
and in the 1950s, when you're talking about, no one talked about sexual abuse back then.
Right. And so I didn't even know the word transition, transsexual, gender dysphoria. None of those things occurred to me until in the 1950s, the name Christine Jorgensen hit the headlines. Marine becomes woman and was a transsexual. And I thought, well, that must be who I am. And so this is kind of what happens. And I think the opposition knows this. If they can get somebody like Bruce Jenner, or in my era, Christine Jorgensen, to be somebody they can identify with, then it's sort of like hooking the person on drugs because they think, oh, that's good. The problem is Christine Jorgensen was never a woman, and Bruce Jenner is still Bruce Jenner, and he's not a woman either. So, and that's not an offense against him. That's just a absolute medical, biological, scientific fact that Caitlin can call himself Caitlin, but he's still he's still biologically a male. So, and so these are the things that we began to use these terminologies, and people began to believe that they are. So I ended up I was going to church, and I was struggling, and I kept praying, take this away from me. But it was more than that. It's taking away sexual abuse. It's taking away now many years
of you needed to heal on so many levels, Walt.
Yes, and people, they beat up prayer saying, well, prayer never works. Well, prayer isn't a one-shot, drive-through window. Prayer takes a great deal of time, but it also takes some understanding of what's causing your behavior, your misguided behavior, what's causing it. And so
and to be fair, my daughters are like, I hope you never have a gay grandchild because you'll never see them because you'll tell them they're bad. I'm like, no, I wouldn't tell them they're bad. I wouldn't. Anyway, but I said, I believe that most people who are pro LGBTQ and the surgery, I believe they all think they're doing what's best. I don't think there's anyone going out, oh, I'm going to cut this guy's penis off. And you know what I mean? I don't have any ill thought, but it's like the demonic, the diabolical underneath it that's twisting the thinking of the doctors and the friends that try to support you and the parent who wants their child happy. So that's really, we have to find a way to deal with how people think. Your books, your life, your testimony, your books is powerful to do so, because this is loaded with stories of men and women who have gone through the same type of journey as you have and have struggled, only to come out and say, listen to my story. Maybe my story can help you as well.
Yes, and it talks in that book about autogynephilia and transvestic fetishes and drag queens. It defines those different groups and explains who they are and what their behaviors are. Some that are homosexual, the ones that aren't homosexual, because unfortunately today, anybody who presents themselves as a cross-gender identity is assumed to be homosexual. I will say that the females that I have encountered, every one of them who identify as men, have been in lesbian relationships. I have not had any that weren't. So there may be some out there, but for some reason, in the female to male are all in lesbian relationships.
But the male to female are not. Oh.
Right. No.
So
only the drag
how old
queens.
were you when you decided that you had to have the surgery? And what made you decide the surgery was necessary?
Well, I was married and I had 2 children. I was very successful working for American Honda Motor Company. I was an executive with the company. I had 2 parking places. I had a great income.
Wow.
And
you were how old?
I was in my late 30s by this time. And so I thought, you know, I'm still struggling with this. And I was trying to cope with the struggle of being sexually abused, cross-dressed, physically abused by using alcohol, which is not a good way to go. And so I knew that I needed to sit down with somebody who knew how to deal with this. So I went to Dr. Paul Walker, who's the one I said in the outset of this discussion today, who wrote the Standards of Care. I had a lot of money, so I went to the #1 guy in the country who I thought could help me understand what's going on in my mind and help me know what the proper treatment was. And I met him and told him my story like I am today. And he says, well, what you need is hormone therapy and gender reassignment surgery, but you need to wait 2 years. This was 1981. And you need to go through this process so that we can be sure that it's going to be effective and work for you. So I started immediately on the hormones. I was married. I told my wife eventually about what was happening and told her that, you know, I don't know where this is going. I'm just trying to deal with this. And so together we tried to understand it, but the hormones really took me to a darker place, even though they were like some kind of tranquilizer in some ways. The female hormones really caused a misdirection in sound thinking. Mm-hmm. And I would call the female hormones in a man a point of temporary insanity because it changes the way you think, feel, and behave. And those 3 elements are the elements in drug addiction and why we become addicted to these different behaviors. So I adopted the behavior that was set forth by using the hormones and became very excited. I was kind of an LGBT pro guy thinking, oh yeah, this is the great thing. I'm doing the right thing. And eventually I know I'll have to divorce my wife. And so when the time came and I was approved twice by the therapist for surgery in April of 1983, I went for gender reassignment surgery. Dr. Biber, and Bowers took over the practice after Biber did. In 1983, I had the surgery and became Laura Jensen female.
When you say the surgery, was that just the top surgery to give you breasts, or is that to remove your genitals?
I wish that I had just done the top.
But all at once, you did it all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So the you know, there's this. When I came out of this, there was a couple of days of this great euphoria. I thought, wow, all this is going to be gone. I felt really good. And I felt good for a long time about what I'd done. By this time I was divorced.
Well, let me go, hold on. So how many years were you married when?
17 years.
And your wife, did she know about the purple dress? Did she know about the sexual abuse? Did she know any of that?
No.
Okay, so then you went and had this surgery, and you had your divorce before the surgery or after?
Before the surgery.
And was she kind of like a kiss on the cheek, I love you, and I just hope you find happiness? It sounds like you had a healthy relationship.
We did, and you know, I met her about 2 years ago again in LA. We met for a moment with my current wife, who I've been married to now for 23 years. We all 3 met, and my ex-wife gave me a hug and said, you know, I'll always love you. I just couldn't live with you. And I'm sorry that you had to go through what you went through. So there wasn't any animosity. Right. She knew that I was struggling. She had told me for many years, I think there's something deeply wrong that you're trying to cover up with alcohol. I really wished you wouldn't drink. And so she could see this, but I couldn't. And you know, the one thing about wives is they can see things that no husband can see.
Yeah.
And admit.
Can I ask you even more personal questions? You can say no to any of my questions, because I want people who are watching this to understand. So you had to have your genitals cut off, and you said you felt euphoric for a while, but my thought about this, because now you're showing our listeners and our viewers that this is a lot more to do with mental, and it's not sexual per se.
Right.
That's but exactly my question was, Yeah, so it's like, well, you can no longer have an orgasm or sexual arousal, right? I mean,
No,
so
you can still have sexual arousal and orgasm.
how?
Well,
How?
they make it work.
Okay. All right. Well, then, I mean, that part's good because I thought that once
Yeah.
the man lost his testicles, that he lost his ability.
They create when they do the surgery a way for that particular process function to continue.
Oh, okay. Because I'd also read some other stories where, because when they take the penis and they try to create a fake vagina, some men's bottom like that has to remain raw to remain kind of wet and tender like a female, and that will cause infection for many men. I mean, that breaks my heart.
Some of the surgeries are done very poorly, and many of the people will have tremendous, horrible odors that will never be repaired. And a lot of it is because they don't take care of the hair that's down there and it gets put inside. It is, frankly, a disaster, even when it's good. But I think it's important. I want the audience to know, because I had surgery, until I was remarried, I never had a relationship with anyone during the 8 years I was Laura Jensen.
Why was that?
Because it wasn't about sex.
Right.
It was about my identity. And I think people really miss that part. They think, oh, he's out there doing this, he's out there doing that. And God knows the truth in my life. I never even went on a date with anybody. I was working toward trying to resolve being criminally sexually abused, physically abused, and emotionally abused by 3 members of my family. And it was never about sex. It was, in fact, if anything was ever said correctly, is that many young people like myself who are sexually abused as young people, the one thing that you want to do, now I want people to hear this and hear it clearly. You want to remove your genitalia, not because you want to become a female, so that you will never, ever be sexually abused again. Removing the genitalia, in many cases, is a defense mechanism against ever being sexually abused. That's true for the women who've been sexually abused. It's true for the men. If a woman has a penis added to their body, they believe in their mind that no one would want to sexually
attractive, right?
So if we can boil this down to what it's going to, this whole transition thing is a lot more, in many cases, about being protected from being sexually and emotionally abused. If we would just take the time to sit down with people and begin to dig into their psychopathology and understand how they got where they are, which is what I do to the people who write me. And that's why I have such insight into this, is because I've been there, and they trust me with information, frankly, that they often
haven't shared with anybody else.
That's exactly right. So, many cases, this has, I will say that you take the homosexual guy, doesn't remove his penis, because that is their joystick. So I think it's important to understand that. And for the person who's been sexually abused that goes through this, they're just trying to protect themselves from sexual abuse, but have an identity and live a life free of being abused.
Mm. So what I hear you saying then is, even when you were living as Laura Jensen, you were always attracted to women?
Absolutely.
Even though you didn't date them?
Right. No. Right. You're the people who with autogynephilia, transvestic fetishes, transvestites, people like myself who've been sexually abused, your sexual orientation stays the same.
Right.
It doesn't change. I don't tell anybody, this is a secret. Sexually, I find men very repugnant.
Well, I like mine.
Yeah,
you know.
well, I'm just saying there's nothing attractive.
There's nothing homosexual about that. Absolutely. You're as
Yeah.
heterosexual as you can be.
Right.
Wow, there's so much. Let me ask you another technical question. What about people who are born androgynous? I used to babysit when I was a little girl. She had she kind of had a penis and a vagina.
Yeah.
And my daughters try to argue with me going, oh, you know, there's no sin against homosexuality. They get to pick their gender. What do you know about androgyna?
Yeah, that's actually the term for it is called intersex.
Intersex, right?
Yeah, and those are medical situations that occur in so rare. I mean, they aren't transgender. None of those will fall into the transgender category. That's a separate medical category that's different than the transgender people. Transgender people don't have a mixture of genitalia or anything female and male within them. And that's why they have this category they call intersex, that is a special category for people who are born with ambiguous genitalia. Now, what I do know is that many of the people actually like to stay in that group as intersex. They feel like that is like such a special thing that they don't want to have surgery. They don't want to necessarily go through any change, but they will identify with what best fits them and what they feel like they're most comfortable with. There's no sin, no foul in that. Even if they are required to have some surgery so they can, in some cases, urinate properly and be able to do things in a way that's effective for them over the rest of their life. So many of the surgeries that are done on the intersex population are done to help them urinate properly, right, and not so much to identify in any particular gender. But that's a
whole separate issue. Yeah, take that off the table.
Yep.
I was curious about that. So when you first transitioned to Laura Jensen, did you tell your boss? Did you have to quit your job?
No, I told my boss. They fired me.
Wow.
They walked me to the gate. My job was over. I ended up homeless and broke, living in a park in Long Beach, California, and an alcoholic with vomit all over me most of the time. I was a disgusting, broken human being. And I started going to AA meetings. And the first AA meeting I went to, two guys saw me and asked me, because I was so disgusting looking. I said, "Where do you live?" I said, "In the park." And one of them said, "You're coming home with us. You know, we'll put you in the garage." So they cleaned up the garage. They went out and got some couches. It was a small house, but they let me live there. And they were in AA too. So there was a group in this house of people who were all going to AA meetings, and I started my recovery, which now I have 34 years sober.
Good for you. Did they know that you were a man who had transitioned to a woman?
Yeah.
You told them that in the meetings.
Yeah. We told that right off. So, but they didn't, they're still my friends today. And so they just think that my journey's miraculous, you know.
It is. And what a gift that they brought you into their home. You know, what a blessing.
They brought me to their garage. They wouldn't let me in the house.
They gave you're right. They gave you a roof over your head.
And they fed me and took good care of me. One of them was quite wealthy, so I was well taken care of.
So many questions I want to ask you. When you first transitioned to Laura, did your sons stop seeing you? How old were they?
Well, my daughter refused to see me again, and she didn't talk to me for 8 years until I detransitioned back, and that's when she began. Yeah, my son looked at me and pointed at me and said, "I see who you are on the outside, but what you don't know is I know who you are on the inside, even though you don't."
How old was he when he said that?
12 years old.
Oh.
And he said, "I would rather have you have cancer and die than for me to tell my friends that you're going through this because it's so horrible."
How did that make you feel?
What do you think? Yeah. Don't have to answer that question.
No, you don't. But the good news is you have a relationship with both of them now, don't you?
Fantastic.
That's beautiful.
My daughter calls me her hero.
You are a hero. You're a hero for so many things that you've said today, being persecuted, as the Lord said we would. So taking your cross and saying, Lord, thank you for the cross you gave me, and I do my best to carry it to your glory. And he said, if you're not being persecuted, you're not doing it right, because you should be, and you are, and you're going to die one day, and you'll get to be like, that cross is gone. Now I get to hang out with Jesus, you know?
Yep.
So you get to do that.
I get the upgrade.
You get the upgrade, yes. So because of time, but I want to get it all in. What caused you to finally say, I got to detransition? This isn't me.
Going to court and then saying you didn't change. No, it's not effective. You can't change a man into a woman. I go, why do I want to be a fake woman? What's the point of that? The whole thing's a fraud. To me, transitioning and the surgery and hormones is the greatest medical fraud of our lifetime.
Yeah, especially when they're doing it to children now.
Yeah, let's start doing the surgery on the people who are doing it to kids.
I agree, but that's a whole separate conversation, because that makes me angry. That makes me angry. You should know better as an intelligent, educated doctor to let a child grow and be 18. That's where the diabolical is really apparent.
Well, they're trying to pay for the Rolls-Royce car payment. They don't care about the kids.
But on the good news, since we're coming short on time, so many things you've been doing. Before I ask you some of my final questions, you said earlier you've got a website, sexchangeregret.com, yes? And that is for who? Who should go to that website?
Anybody who has an interest in learning about the consequences, about the books that have been written, about the articles that have been written. You can go to the bookstore and review the books. You hit the bookstore button and buy books there. And certainly we're not a 501. I'm 80 years old living on Social Security. So if anybody feels the nudge from the Lord to make a donation, they can make a donation. It's not something they can take off on their taxes. It's a gift. They can do that too. So, but it's chock full of information and stories, as well as the books are. All of that is there to educate people and help them understand what the consequences are from giving people hormones and surgery. That's what we're about.
Well, because I have 3 million questions, but I only have time for like none, let me ask you two things. It's a fill in the blank. The first thing, when I die, I will know my life has been a success if.
I know the Lord, so yeah, I know it's a success.
You know it already is. Yeah. Okay, well, I don't ever like people listening to my show and going, oh, that was really nice, and then going back to their life. I, like you, I want people changed. So name one thing you'd have our viewers do differently as a result of something they heard today.
Well, I think anybody will be changed by reading Trans Life Survivors and Paper Genders. And those two books alone are actually life-changing books, and people write me about it. That Trans Life Survivors is being translated. In fact, right now it's being published in the Czech Republic in Prague. We actually have made headway in the Czech Republic so that they're going to be passing laws there to prevent children under 19 from being transitioned.
Wow, wonderful. How many languages is this book in? Just this and in Czech so far?
That's only been out, Czech. That one's, it's going to be looking at going into Portuguese for the Brazil audience. I have a Transgender's Faith as being translated and published in South Korea. I have Paper Genders that's being published right now in Italy. And we have other possibilities coming out next year.
Your life really is a success. I mean, not only are you a son of the Most High God, and you're going to go to heaven, he loves you anyway, but even in terms of earthly value, what a success to have 1 or 2 or 3 or 20 or 50 people coming up to you saying, because of you, because of you, I detransitioned. I found my voice. I love me. That must be so rewarding. Let me ask you that. I thought it was my last questions, but what is one of the most rewarding stories you have ever heard from someone whose life was touched by your story or your work?
It's probably the most simple one. The ones that write me and say, I was transitioning until I saw your website, and now I'm not going to do it.
Amen. Wow. Well, I'd love to maintain a relationship with you, and we can talk about some of your other books if you ever want to do an interview about maybe paper
genders.
Paper genders, yes. Or any of your other books. I think this is a topic that we need to stay on. And you and I both know the enemy is trying to silence us. They're going to try to block this show, your shows. They try to block your books. They've already blocked research on the internet from people finding out the truth about gender dysphoria. So anything that goes against their agenda. So if you ever want to talk about a new book or speaking, call me and I will give you a platform here if you'd like.
I would love to, yeah.
So you reach out to me anytime you want. I am so blessed by what you've done. So one more time, for my viewers, Walt Heyer here, you can find him at his website, sexchangeregret.com. You can find stories, articles from him and others who have contributed. You can get a list of all the books he has written. You can get help to someone, a family member or a friend who may be thinking of going down this path. And you don't have the words for it, but Walt does. And maybe sometimes you have to just hand them this and say, just read this before you make that decision and let the Lord do the rest. You know, he can do it all, but he's called you and me to make these decisions for him.
One thing that's really important, do not hand a book to somebody that you have not read yourself, because you will not be able to have a good dialogue with them if you're just handing it off. You read it, you understand it, so you can sit down and discuss it with them later.
That's a good point. So this one, for instance, Trans Life Survivors, is a collection of 30 different stories of men and women who have transitioned and transitioned back, or some that were on the cusp of it. Some have committed suicide because of it. Really quickly, Paper Genders, how is that one different?
Paper Genders is the history. How did it get started? Who were the men that started it? And how they knew it was a disaster early on. And there's some stories in there that people have written me and we've shared in there. So they get to see in that book how we should not be introducing this to young children because their minds are not fully developed until they're 24 years old. So introducing these hormones and these changes to them before their mind is fully developed is child abuse.
Yes. Are you a grandpa?
Yeah, I am.
How many times?
Just one.
Just one? Slacker.
He's great. Yeah.
I'm only 55 and I have 6. So God has blessed me.
All right.
I'm broker than you are.
There you go.
To all my viewers, I just want to let you know, well, I'm blessed by each of you for watching this show. Forward this show to your family and friends. I have started this YouTube channel, though I've been on the air for over 10 years. We've moved we still have the regular radio show. We've moved into this podcast as well. And these stories, the guests that God brings me are amazing, as you have just seen. And these shows need to get into the hands of many, many people. So I'm asking you to subscribe. Just hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell, and you will be notified when a new video comes out. But like and share this. And as Walt just said, be diligent. You know, this might be, if you don't want to get the book or read the book because you're just not a reader, and you just want to watch this show because you've spent an hour of your life, you can forward this show to someone to help them. Post it on your Facebook page. One thing I've learned is don't be afraid of the persecution. You develop tough skin. As long as you learn to speak the truth in love, you're doing your part. Would you add anything to that, Walt?
No, thank you so much for this time. It's been a pleasure for me, and God bless you.
God bless you as well. Well, Well, I'm Dr. Christine Bacon. Go to my website, breakfastwithbacon.com. You can not only find all the YouTube shows, you can find out about my, and I was going to ask that, well, I am still always up for hire for speaking and writing, things like that. Well, you speak as well.
Yes.
And they can get a hold of you, still going to the same website, sexchangeregret.com.
Yes.
Hire Walt. He'll do a fantastic job of putting the message out that you can't. But I know we got to go. So again, go to my website, breakfastwithbacon.com. You can find this show and every show I've ever done. You can go subscribe to all my social media. Sadly, it's what you got to do these days. But we got to go. I just want to say, I am Dr. Christine Bacon. You've been watching Breakfast with Bacon. And I want to remind you always to live your life sunny side up.